This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Iranians defy their tyrannical regime and cry for freedom. Could the Islamic Republic of Iran collapse? Plus, NATO leaders meet at their 70th anniversary and question the role of Turkey. And Christian business people come to Israel and take on the BDS movement.
We're going to do the opposite. They might want to boycott Israel. We're going to come to bless Israel.
All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. President Trump recently spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about the threat of Iran. The call came after Netanyahu issued a strong warning to 6 European countries for trying to bypass U.S. sanctions against Iran. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
Prime Minister Netanyahu encouraged protesters against the Iranian regime and blasted 6 European countries for wanting to do business with Tehran.
In Tehran, in Baghdad, in Beirut, people are taking to the streets. They're being slaughtered by the hundreds, yet they continue to protest.
Iranians are protesting rising prices and corruption. Iraqis protesting corruption in their Shiite-led government and growing Iranian influence. And the Lebanese are protesting against their government, which includes the Iranian-backed Hezbollah.
And while the people of the Middle East bravely stand up to Iran and its henchmen, here's the absurd thing. While all of this is happening, countries in Europe are working to bypass U.S. sanctions against Iran, while the Iranian regime is killing its own people. European countries rush to support that very murderous regime.
6 European countries announced their intention to join Instex last Friday. France, Britain, and Germany created Instex as a barter system to evade U.S. sanctions against Iran.
These European countries should be ashamed of themselves. Have they learned nothing from history? Well, apparently not. They're enabling a fanatic terrorist state to develop nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, thereby bringing disaster to themselves and upon everyone else.
President Trump withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal in May 2018 and clamped sanctions on Iran. Netanyahu has been sounding the alarm about Iran's nuclear intentions for years. He said Europe should join U.S. sanctions and increase pressure on Iran.
To those who favor appeasement of Iran, I say this: history and your own people will judge you harshly. Change course now.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
NATO leaders met in London for 2 days of talks. It marked the 70th anniversary of the organization that's been called the most successful alliance in history. But the group of 29 nations is facing a number of challenges. And one of the main questions is the role of Turkey. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, but during the NATO meetings, French President Macron wondered whether Turkey should continue to be part of the alliance.
How is it possible to be a member of the alliance, to work with all of us, to buy our materials, to be integrated, and to buy the S-400 from Russia?
Earlier, Macron said NATO suffered brain death in part because President Trump pulled out of Syria without consulting his NATO allies, and because of Turkey's invasion of northeast Syria.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder against ISIS. And sometimes they work with ISIS process. This is an issue, and this is a strategic issue.
Yet during the summit, President Trump defended Turkey.
Well, I can only say we have a very good relationship with Turkey and with President Erdogan. I do.
Middle East expert Seth Frantzman believes Turkey came to the summit with a strategy.
It tried to kind of blackmail NATO and say, we're not going to approve any other things that NATO's doing unless you agree with what we're doing in Syria.
Frantzman says President Erdogan saw President Trump as an ally.
I think Turkey went there kind of expecting Donald Trump and the U.S. administration to be very sympathetic, because it's kind of cast a spell over the administration by claiming that the former administration under Obama had not given it Patriot missiles and things like that, and therefore Turkey has a right to buy Russian missiles.
Many have criticized Erdogan's invasion of northeast Syria after atrocities like this one, where Turkish-backed soldiers killed 12, including 8 children, in a mortar attack. It's why Kurdish protesters took to the streets of London during the summit.
NATO is still supporting him. The UK is still selling arms to him. America is still supporting him, and we need help because we don't have any power ourselves.
Turkey's role in NATO and its ethnic cleansing in Syria is just one of the major issues facing the Middle East. I discussed some of those issues with senior editor John Waggy and Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl in our studio. John and Julie, great to be with you again, talking about these issues in the Middle East. John, first of all, here in Israel, they're in uncharted political waters. What's the latest twist?
Absolutely. The latest twist is that Avigdor Lieberman, the head of the Israel Beitenu party, has said basically there's no way that they're going to come up with a unity government between now and the time that the deadline expires. So that basically means that they're heading for elections sometime in February at the earliest and into March later on.
And this is historic, right?
It's historic. Uncharted waters all over the place. Never 3 times in a year for elections. Never this kind of deadlock among the Israeli electorate. And the question, looking into it, if this really works out like that, is how are Israelis going to change their vote if they have to go to the polls for another election?
Julie, while the political instability inside Israel is going on, there's threats all over the place here in the Middle East towards Israel.
That is for sure, and probably the biggest one, or the one that's behind everything, is Iran. You know, I think it's interesting, though, that even though there's all this political turmoil in Israel, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, man, he just really steps up to the plate when it comes to Iran. He met with Secretary of State Pompeo, and he said he had 3, his first 3 things to discuss were Iran, Iran, and Iran. So Iran is definitely moving in. They're trying to set up the bases in Syria. Now there's word that they've been trying to move missiles into Iraq. There was also apparently another strike on an Iranian base in Syria. Prime Minister was asked if he had okayed that for Israel. He just didn't comment on it. So, Iran is definitely there everywhere.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And John, the NATO meetings happened this week in London, and one of the big issues there was Turkey. And there seems to be an interesting relationship and dynamic between Turkey's President Erdogan and the U.S. President Trump.
Right, with just about the rest of the world criticizing President Trump for having this relationship with Erdogan, and the facts coming out that Turkey is seeking to enlarge its empire, if you want to call it that, it's got people scratching their heads. I think there's something that Trump wants from Erdogan that we're not really hearing about right now, but in the meantime, Turkey's looking more and more like a bad actor in the Middle East, even though they're our ally and we have nuclear weapons parked right in the middle of the country. So trying to figure out Erdogan is going to be another challenge on top of the Iran situation Julie was talking about. Exactly. And President Trump, the last thing he wants is any kind of conflict or war heading into the 2020 elections.
Exactly, yeah. One more big political story we'll be watching for. John, Julie, great to be with you. And John, great to have you back here in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Chris.
Coming up, prime ministers, presidents, and politicians have all tried to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without success. One Middle East expert says he knows why. Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and friendship. It's an idea that's been talked of for years, but never realized. Why? CBN's Gary Lane talked with Middle East expert Robert Spencer, who takes on that question in a new book. Take a look.
Let's begin with the claim that the Palestinians have always been on the land long before the Israelis or the Jews came there.
Well, of course, there's the famous quote from Mark Twain when he went through that area in the late 19th century and said that it was absolutely desolate. He would go for miles and miles without seeing a single human being. Also, there is the evidence of the Palestinian names, their surnames that are common, that often betray origins from somewhere else. There is also an abundance of other records that I have in the book of people going through the area and saying, we didn't see anybody. We saw some Jews over here, and then we would go for miles and not see anybody, and there were a few Christian Arabs here and there. But in terms of there being a Muslim Arab presence, that actually comes from after the Zionist settlement began in earnest, and Jews started to move into the area in large numbers. The Arabs then moved in next to them in order to benefit financially from their presence.
Now, how about the claim, and I'm sure you've heard this, I've heard it too, from Palestinians, that Abraham, Moses, and even Jesus were Palestinians. Where did that come from?
That's from the Quran. The Quran portrays all of those and many other biblical figures as Muslim prophets who taught Islam. And then the idea is that the followers of those prophets twisted and hijacked their teachings to create Judaism and Christianity. So Jesus himself, according to this view, was a Muslim prophet who taught Islam, but then the apostles and the other followers of Jesus actually misrepresented and misunderstood and twisted his teachings to create Christianity. Now, this is, of course, ridiculous on so many levels. There's no biblical evidence for it. There's no historical evidence for it. There is, in Islam, the idea that there was an original gospel that was twisted into the New Testament, but that doesn't exist. There's no manuscript evidence of it, and so on. So the whole thing is absurd. But on that basis, it's really a replacement supremacist claim that they can say we embody the true form of Judaism and Christianity, and thus we have a greater right to Jerusalem and the Holy Land in general than anybody else.
So really it's replacing the Jews and the Christians in the Holy Land.
Absolutely.
Now another claim is that, well, the Jews forced us out of Palestine.
Yes.
But you say that's not true, that it actually came from Muslim leaders who encouraged them to leave after 1948. Tell me about that.
That's right. Specifically, it was the Arab Higher Committee. And there is abundant record, I have it in the book, of the Arab Higher Committee being publicly known as having told the Arabs to leave in 1948 because they thought that they were going to crush Israel in a matter of weeks, and then the Arabs would be able to move back.
And you spent quite a bit of time in the book about the peace process and the history over the years, and you show that it has been a failed process. What can be done now?
Well, what we need to do in the first place is end it. It was based on false premises, and it's never going to work. It's only, as far as the Palestinians and their supporters are concerned, a means in order to weaken Israel, a means by which they can weaken Israel.
And you say it's really not a political war here, it's more spiritual.
There's no doubt about that, yeah. The idea is that the Muslims must follow the Quran, drive them out from where they drove you out. That's what the Quran says in chapter 2, verse 191. That is the cornerstone of their approach to Israel. They claim they were driven out. Now, we've already discussed they were not actually driven out, but that's a staple of their propaganda. And on that basis, they say they have a responsibility before Allah to drive the Israelis out. It's like, it's as if it were one of the 10 Commandments as far as they're concerned.
Well, Robert Spencer, the book is The Palestinian Delusion. Thanks so much for being with us.
Pleasure, Gary. Thank you.
Up next, hundreds of Christian business people from around the world come to combat BDS and stand economically with the Jewish state. International Christian business people are taking on the BDS movement against Israel by pursuing business with companies in the Jewish state and more. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
They came to bless Israel and in turn be blessed themselves at the Arise Summit 2019. The conference provides business opportunities between Israelis and Christians.
We have here between 300 and 400 international business people from over 40 nations who have come here to connect to what they consider to be a miracle of biblical proportions. The exciting thing that's happening in the Israeli economy with innovation and technology.
Kalev Myers began and leads the alliance to reinforce Israel's security and economy.
We're really tackling some of the greatest crises around the world, and so we've invited them in order to connect with Israeli businesses, meet face to face, and create those connections and transactions that'll help bring Israeli innovation to the world.
Israeli companies included Safe Mode, an artificial intelligence and behavior modification system to improve road safety in commercial fleets. Rewalk, a bionic system that enables paraplegics to stand, walk, and climb stairs. and Kite Pride, a social business that's helping women and men exit forced prostitution and human trafficking. One of the Israeli companies here even sells locusts to eat. Did you know that locusts are healthy, kosher, and some even say they taste good? They even have gummy bears, or shall we call them gummy hoppers? Maybe this is why John the Baptist liked locusts and honey. With the global food challenge in mind, Dror Tamir helped start Hargol Food Tech 6 years ago.
We are producing grasshoppers to feed the world.
By working with Israel, these business people are also taking a proactive stand against the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, or BDS.
Let's be strategic. Let's not invest a lot of time and energy fighting this with legal and legislative means. Let's just do more business. Our largest delegation this year is from Sweden, which I think is fantastic because there's a growing BDS campaign in Sweden, a campaign to boycott and isolate Israel. So the fact the evangelical Christian business community there stood up and said, we're going to do the opposite. They might want to boycott Israel. We're going to come to bless Israel.
Sweden's Jan Sturveson is chairman of the International Christian Chambers of Commerce. He's been building bridges with Israel for years.
We need a new perspective of what is Israel, the leading hub of innovation, industrial development, knowledge creation, etc., and entrepreneurship. So how do we tap into that hub?
Some 300 matchmaking meetings took place.
It's a blessing that anybody who wants to be blessed connects to Israel. People here are actually, with their businesses, becoming a flame in the menorah of God.
And what did the Christian businessmen think?
We are looking to partner with Israel because they have solutions that we need.
I'm excited to understand that there is a divine calling in doing business in Israel.
Myers sees business as the future for Israeli-Christian relations because it forms stronger ties and gives the opportunity for mutual blessings. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Rishon LeZion, Israel.
Up next, it's a marvel of nature. Every year, hundreds of millions of birds make Israel their home on their way to Africa and Europe. About 500 million birds migrate through Israel twice each year. The country lies along one of the world's major migration routes, and it's a paradise for bird watchers. The Hula Valley hosts millions of birds and thousands of visitors each year.
This is one of the richest sites in the world for bird watching.
Israel sort of is a junction between three continents, and birds that are essentially trying to avoid high mountains, great expanses of water, they funnel through very specific flyways.
Some of these migrating birds fly 2,000 miles in 3 to 5 days without a meal. They fly from Europe and Asia to Africa. For many, Israel is the halfway point. That point is the Hula Valley, part of a 3,700-mile stretch from Syria to Mozambique. The Bible mentions the bird migration as part of a metaphor. Even the stork in the sky knows her seasons, and the turtle dove and the swift and the thrush observe the time of their migration. Some 400 species of birds stop for refueling, and a fraction even winters here, including 30 to 45,000 cranes. Listening to them talk, one can understand why King Hezekiah said he chattered like a crane. In fact, it's not just noise. Experts say crane parents and chicks can actually recognize each other's voices. 20 years ago, there were hardly any cranes here because the natural swamps were drained for farmland. The ground didn't work for agriculture, however, so experts restored part of the lake.
And the answer was essentially to give it back to nature. And so the project has gone sort of in a circle, and we are back to trying to renovate, trying to sort of reproduce what existed here in the past.
That and a special feeding project brought the cranes back, along with the visitors.
This is a wonderful opportunity for us to educate people about birds, about nature. I think that you don't need to be a bird lover when you are coming here, but you are definitely a bird lover when you are going out of this site.
Visitors to Agamon Hahula Reserve can ride the safari wagon into the midst of the cranes. Guides say there's no place else in the world to see so many cranes in such a small area. and bird watchers come from all over to see the phenomenon.
I don't even care if you like birds. You have to experience this and come and see thousands and thousands and thousands of cranes.
If you're a birder, I don't think you could find a better place to come to see the variety of species, as well as the atmosphere and the beauty of the place. It's just unrivaled in any place in the world.
Well, that's one of the natural wonders here in Israel. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us.